Where things collapse is where there hasn't been enough attention to really making things sort of tacit, more explicit, more understood, more codified. We can get trapped by sort of success in many ways. We're all in this together. I think anything we do to avoid this sense that there's that kind of driver-passenger dynamic.
Welcome to Grit in the Boardroom. I'm Erika Eliasson-Norris, and today's conversation explores how purpose becomes progress and how leaders can build meaning that lasts across generations. My guest is Sharath Jeevan OBE, a trusted advisor to CEOs and leadership teams worldwide. As founder and executive chairman of Intrinsic Labs and leader of the Generational Success Lab at Oxford University's Syad Business School, he helps organisations build purposeful strategies, enduring cultures, and authentic intergenerational collaboration. His clients include Oxford and Cambridge universities, Teach for All, L'Oreal, Shopify and the NHS, and many more. Sharath is the author of Intrinsic and Inflection, and is now writing Inheritable, a novel exploring intergenerational leadership. Previously, he founded and led Stir Education and Teaching Leaders, reaching over 10 million children across 40,000 schools globally. Outside work, Sharath is an internationally competitive pickleball player and a student of wine. He lives in London with his wife and 2 teenage sons. Sharath, welcome to Grit in the Boardroom.
Thanks, Erika.
So to start with, you often speak about future-proofing lasting success. What does that really mean in practice for leaders and organisations today?
Yeah, I think one of the challenges, Erika, I don't know if you would agree from your boardroom experience, is our timeframes are quite short. And I see, even CEOs of organizations, I think a lot about the second hand, the minute hand, and the hour hand. And so much of the pressure today is on the second hand, the minute hand, rather than thinking about the hour hand and what is that long-term direction, purpose, the place that the leaders really want to go to help people get to places they wouldn't have got to otherwise. That's my definition of leadership. And what's been coming out from that is also not just within a generation, but also taking the long road and thinking what that means cross-generationally as well.
And how do you think leaders can support with that cross-generational work?
I think part of it is trying to really find disruptive ideas that really will shape the future, will shape that better world. So I've been lucky to work with about 30 or 40 really exciting organizations. They can be ventures, they can be part of larger organizations, startups, you name it, that are trying to build a different future in terms of how kids, for example, experience the world, in terms of how young people enter the workforce, all of those kinds of themes as well. So part of the work is really helping that disruptive community thrive, flourish, and be even more distinctive and be more successful. The other side of the work I find myself doing is helping existing organizations that have scale already, large corporates, large foundations, public sector organizations like the NHS, think about how they can actually manage and navigate that intergenerational transition better so that understanding and collaboration can happen better between generations. So I sort of think we need new ideas, new ways of doing things coming into the world, but we also need those who've already got power and skill to reshape what they do at the same time.
And when you look at boards in today's society, do you think that they're prepared for the expectations of that kind of Gen Z kind of investors, let's say, and employees alike?
Yeah, I think boards are in a very tricky place right now overall. I've had a chance, the fortune to work with many of them. I mostly work with leadership teams and CEOs, but of course the board is an important factor, and almost always our work tends to interface with that really important element. I still think board, I know your work is all about this, Erika, but it is still very much a defensive sort of play. It feels very much about mitigating risk is often the mindset.
Yes.
It's quite cautious. It can often be quite short term. That's something that really surprised me observing some of the boards I was able to work with. I thought that the idea of being a steward in that way was to have that long-term stewardship that would future-proof really an organization to many years, maybe decades, maybe centuries ahead, but often the pressure is on quarterly results or short-term performance. And I think it's an interesting question of how leadership teams, CEOs and boards work together better to shift that culture, I think, as well.
Yeah, I think sometimes boards can be very focused on, as you say, the short term, because that's what they're incentivized. That's their performance metrics, and therefore that directs travel. How do you think leaders can help look at that longer term view? How do you help organizations do that?
So being super honest, I often take them out of the board structure for a little while to give them a safe space, often 3 or 6 months, where they can explore different realities, I think with the board dynamics, even when there's the closest relationships, let's say between a board chair and CEO, and I say this having had an excellent board chair myself when I was a CEO over my years of leading, there's still a performative element of that game, right? You're still trying to show that you're in control, you've got it sorted. It's quite hard to be vulnerable if you're a CEO, hard to express doubt, not even doubt, but even express uncertainty. And I'm not quite sure, these are 3 crossroads I could take, and I'm not sure which way to go. That can often make a CEO look, what's a her or a him, look weak, indecisive, and so on. And that says a lot about how we think about leadership, and some of our sort of mental models about it, and how maybe misguided they are, but it is what it is. So often taking CEOs and leadership teams away for a little while, I don't mean physically all the time, but give them that safe space to reflect, think about what they really see the problem being in their sector or industry, help them think about what makes their perspective unique and different. And from them crafting a direction that really feels authentic and distinctive to them, rather than just copying what everyone else is doing. And around halfway through that process, usually a couple of months in, where they've gained some confidence, feeling good about things, we often bring in the board for an early pass to say, how does this feel? And really want to make sure they shape it, of course, and play a very, very proactive role. But I have had fun just giving a bit of neutral space can be quite helpful in that regard, actually.
And why do so many leadership teams, they seem to really struggle with planning for success beyond their own tenure? Why do you think that might be, and what can they do to kind of overcome that barrier?
And I say this, myself as a founder CEO, and it's very tricky after we entangle ourselves. I think a therapist would say enmesh ourselves with the organizations we lead. That it's very hard to separate those things. I think one of the things I've found the best CEOs and leadership teams doing is say, look, I'm here to take the organization to a place it wouldn't have got to otherwise. That's my role. I'm going to take it from A to B, but I know someone else who needs to take it from B to C, C to D. There are going to be many more chapters. Think of it almost like a novel. As a result, I need to create the foundational scaffolding of culture in particular that allows us to keep reinventing, keep being relevant. And that kind of lifelong learning muscle is really important, especially in this day and age where things are changing so fast. How do we really try and build that culture in where people are open to being adaptive, to be reflective, to be experimental where needed? So I think there's a lot CEOs can do to prepare. They may not know what the next few chapters of the book might be, but they can set almost the chapter outline well by creating that cultural foundation and role modeling and showing them they themselves don't have all the answers. They're trying to search and discover things, find that from different people.
And there are writers as well that talk as well about seasons. So they say you might be a winter CEO or a summer CEO, depending on if you're talking about the highs and the lows. And they very much are very good in certain situations when you're riding on a very high, or perhaps, it's a turnaround situation. There are many people that kind of focus in on that sort of approach, and they have that level of experience. How can someone be, I suppose, open to being challenged, but also be self-aware enough to work out and establish where they fit best and where their skills are?
I think it's really powerful, the sort of the seasons metaphor, the winter, summer stuff. We've got global warming happening, whatever happens. And I'm almost more interested in sort of how do CEOs build that long-term muscle where they can think, much more strategically, much more with a 10, 20-year horizon towards what they're doing. So they may be in a turnaround, but they're thinking about, okay, how do I not just get us back to where we were, but actually build towards the future? Or they're really thriving and flourishing and think, how can they get, much more, have much more impact in the world, be much more influential, make a real difference to our customers or clients or communities, whatever sector they're in. So I sort of feel like there's that seasonality piece, but there's also that long-term, existential questions that I think every business or organization should try and focus on.
And where do you think those questions should be asked, and by whom?
Good question. I think ultimately the CEO and the leadership team are accountable for it. I think boards can play an important sense checking and stewardship role, but there's always an asymmetry of information, of involvement as well, right? They're just much more into the day-to-day there. I think a lot of it comes from discovery and searching and being able to ask good questions, being much more curious about the world, asking their customers, that the communities are impacting, their employees, of course, what they can do more really as well, and being that kind of really thinking about being observant. So if I take an example, I've been working with King's College London, obviously a really premier global research university. There's been about £100 million of research funding coming through for really important areas around global health. And there's been a big shock to that system with some of the aid cuts around the world and so on. So what the university said is, look, we've got all this funding. Are we really pulling it together in the best way possible? Right now, each researcher, each department is going off on its own sort of separate path, if you like, as well. How can we be more than the sum of our parts? And how can we they've created an institute, and there's a really inspiring director there called Melanie Abbas. And how can we give a really coherent frame to where we want to go? And what they've decided to do is think about, how do we partner with universities in the global south, who themselves have been hit very, very hard by some of these cuts? How can we help build their leadership, their capabilities, their reputation, so they can attract research funding themselves, but also build a new generation of researchers at the same time? So that's, I think, a good example where it's not just a linear, let's go from A to B, but try to go from to many more levels at the same time.
And how do you think leadership teams can overcome some of those blind spots? Because you don't know what you don't know, essentially. How can you kind of hold a mirror up and actually see behind you where you can never see?
Yeah. I think it's one of the most challenging pieces, and I definitely felt it myself as a CEO. And what I found is most teams, among the 50 or so organizations I've worked with over these past years, they tend to look outside in rather than inside out, Erika. So rather than look at themselves and say, look, what are we doing well? What can we go? Often we do the kind of SWOT style thing. We know it's called different things, but basically that's what it is.
Yeah.
Instead, look at the problem itself. What's the sector you're contributing? Let's say it's healthcare. What's happening in healthcare now? We know, for example, I've just been working with the NHS, and there's been a whole migration to community health and primary care. If that's happening, what does that mean for how we need to structure the whole service? But also, what does it mean from a leadership capability piece? So very practically, if you have surgeries, GP surgeries, how do you make sure that those leading those as senior partners and so on know what to do to attract the next generation of trainees and young doctors and help them create that long-term pathway? So I think a lot of it is going back to the problem itself and saying, what have we learned new? What's different about our understanding of that? How do we try and accelerate that in the future?
And where did your curiosity about purpose and human motivation, where did it begin?
So I'm the son of Indian immigrants to this country. I came when I was about 4. We grew up quite a bit in the Middle East as well. My parents worked there in Saudi Arabia. And I think there was always quite a lot I have incredible parents who did everything for us to succeed and be successful. Classic sort of immigrant story. They were highly educated, but had come to a new country, had to start again in many ways. But I think as a result, there was quite a lot of pressure to pursue extrinsic definitions of success, external. So, high status jobs, financial success, of course, education. And those were all useful to a point. But I realized that at some point I had to find my own path. And about 10 or 12 years in, I jumped off the corporate treadmill, honestly, at some point, and became an entrepreneur, set up these 2 organizations that you mentioned earlier on. And it was the best thing I could have done. I think I realized that sometimes we can get trapped by sort of success in many ways, and defining it for ourselves, going intrinsically thinking about our own purpose and so on can matter a lot. And by a strange coincidence, I worked with a lot of teachers, about 200,000 teachers in those first organizations, helping them think about their purpose and meaning in their profession. And so that sort of made me think a lot about, what does it mean at a large scale? For many jobs in the workforce, this is a problem. How do we make this something that really is applicable to anyone at the same time?
And talking a bit about purpose, how do organizations, how do leaders avoid purpose washing? And how do you kind of bring that in to be a core part of strategy?
Yeah, and there's a lot of, the Unilever stuff about, how do mayonnaise being purposeful, all that. There's a lot of this, you can joke about it. I think one of the key things that I found that's really important is to be really authentic and distinctive. So I think about the corporate world. I was helping the B Corp movement about a year and a half ago. They certify companies to signal corporate responsibility. We had very large companies like Whole Foods, Coots, etc. sign up. About 2 or 3% of GDP now in the UK comes to that movement in just a few years. So I think it would have been very easy for them to say, let's go from, I think at that point they were 2%, let's go to 5% over the next 3 years. But they had a very enlightened sort of CEO and leadership team, and it was really great working with them and helping think about some of these things. But they were saying, let's, rather than do that only, let's look at the underlying drivers. Who influences businesses? That's pension funds, regulators, government, and of course the business community itself. How can we start to work at some of the root cause level and really start to work much more systemically, much more structurally, as well as keep growing, of course, the number of members and our share of GDP at the same time. So yeah, I think it's that sort of being able to flip and think differently about things.
And was there a defining experience or person who shaped your view on leadership as a service?
I think, to be honest, so I would go and work with governments a lot, Erika, when I was working in education, and see civil servants, often in places like Africa or India, where they were just there was just so much going on. They had to deal with hundreds of thousands of staff members.
Wow.
I think India has now about 1.2 million schools, to take an example. Just the scale of these systems was just unbelievable. It puts anything in the UK, it sounds like peanuts in comparison. But they still were visionary, still very driven to make a difference in very, very challenging contexts. And they weren't always, fully successful, but there was a real desire to still make that change, despite the difficult odds against them, I think, as well. And so it made me think, I live in a much more privileged part of the world. I work with many organizations that are in much better financial shape, for example. We must make the most of what we can, surely, what we've got there as well. So I think that's seeing that, what is possible under challenging circumstances.
It's very motivating, isn't it?
It
It's
is
very grounding.
Yeah, it is. And I think they had a very clear sense. I define purpose very simply about how does our work help and serve others? They had a very strong sense. If I do this, that means a teacher in our system will be able to teach much better. They'll have more space to do that. They'll feel more empowered. That will mean the child will be more receptive. They'll build a better relationship, etc. So they could see all the way through the chain, if you like, of impact, and see what will my work sitting in some fancy office, or actually wasn't always that fancy, in a ministry, what will that mean at the level of the individual I'm ultimately helping and serving?
Yeah, that's pretty amazing. You create a legacy, don't you?
I think legacy is something I think my generation is struggling with quite a bit. I'm almost 50 now, I should say, Erika, and we've been joking a lot about quiet quitting among Gen Z. I do quite a bit of stand-up jokes around it, but I do think my generation is quiet leading. I think we're not always really partnering with the next gen and working with them to really develop a common understanding of what success looks like, how to shape the future, what the strategy of the organization needs to be, how we can contribute to being a better world as well. We've tended to, often we're quite comfortable, we know what we're doing, we're now working a bit more remotely as well, which gives us more reasons to sort of insulate ourselves from the next generation. I think it's more important than ever for us to collaborate. And that's why I set up this new center at Oxford, Side Business School, where the whole idea is to help the next gen on the program think about how they can have more impact and influence with those above them in the workforce, those that will be leading them, but also to, we bring in senior leaders all the time to work with them on those questions. So there's real dialogue and collaboration. And there are moments of frustration, inertia, dissonance, all of it. But it's amazing once it clicks, you can get really great collaboration and just deeper empathy and understanding between generations at the same time.
Do you think that there are things to be learnt from one generation to the next, either older generations to younger and likewise the other way around?
Absolutely, yeah. So I think there's a lot of, generational trauma, I think, that many of us experience. So things that we were passed down to us. If I think of my generation, we're in that sort of C-suite typically. Many things were sort of given almost like biblically. This is how you lead. We watched all these films and you were taught you had to have a step up for lip and be very calm and all of those elements. I don't think we often ask why was that the received wisdom? What were the assumptions of those times? Are they relevant to a world now which is moving at hyper speed? It's very volatile, has AI as a big feature. A lot of that stuff I think we need to offload and take away the baggage. So I think if my generation can think a little bit more reflectively, what do we want to hold on to from our past experience? But what are we willing to let go of? I think the next gen is in a much more radical spirit. They really want to reshape the world much more profoundly. And I think we can look incremental to them. And I think boards can look even more incremental. And I think we have to respond and we have to show we are open to reshaping things together.
I gave a talk at a senior school only a couple of weeks ago, 16, 17-year-olds, talking about careers and kind of pathway forward. And I asked them how many of them wanted to go to university. I asked them how many of them wanted to go into business, given that was what I was talking about. And I'd say a smaller percentage than I thought put their hand up for university, and I would say 80% of the room put their hands up for some sort of entrepreneurial business, having some autonomy to kind of manage things themselves and do things maybe as a consultant, maybe as a sole consultant. But there seems to be a very different view of the art of possible, I would say, in this younger generation that's kind of coming through now.
Yeah. No, so I'm hosting a dinner on Wednesday actually at the Winemakers Club. I'm a wine fanatic, as you know. And it's with parents actually who've got older children who have around 19, 20, 21 who are leaving university, find the job market very, very tough right now. And the discussion we're talking about is and it's with a collaborator called Matt Nichols, a good friend, this idea of family business 2.0. So it's a term he invented. But this kind of idea that, in previous generations, we would try and integrate vertically as families because the economic environment was so uncertain. We didn't have those structures of big corporates or big employers in the same way. We're kind of throwing the question out of, are we going back into that world where, if your kids are living with you when they're 22 or 23, they can't afford their own housing, the job market's more precarious. What do we do as parents? Do we try and, do we work with them? Do we create things together? Do we invest in ventures they do, for example, whether that's directly or indirectly? What's our role as parents? So I think there's some interesting questions and quite tricky ones to navigate. But again, I think we get the conversations going better between generations, that collaboration can be much more fruitful. I think that will be a way of life. And that might simply be just being encouraging and supportive in the broader sense, or it might be, actually, we can do something and do something very tangibly at the same time.
And looking at the kind of younger generation, there's definitely some different ideas around ethics, perhaps, that maybe a number of generations above us would have kind of thought it's all about profit, it's all about money, I'm in a business, whereas they have some different kind of views around ethics. I'm interested to know your thoughts. If, given your kind of B Corp background as well and the work you've done with them, in an organisation, if they were to be a profitable organisation, but essentially ethically indefensible and wanted to change and to move and to pivot and do things differently. I know a number of organisations, for instance, that fit into that category that find it very difficult to hire the younger generation because they just, the whole concept of what they do just turns them off. How do organisations move and shift into that new space?
So I think what happens a lot, I think we get into a lot of these questions around greenwashing and all these things about these big questions around purpose and so on. I think a lot of it's more day-to-day and much more mundane about how we treat people day-to-day. So I was a big, I'm not going to mention the company, but I was using a wine service, an online thing, and I was a big fan. I bought about 50 bottles of the last couple of years from them. They had an event where you had to sign up to the event and you could bring a guest, but the guest had to sign up for their service and put their credit card down and all this kind of stuff. And I just canceled my subscription. I said, look, this is not, I almost said, like, what would a Gen Z think? I need to do the same thing. This is not, it's not that it's not corruption in some way, but it just doesn't feel right. Why are you doing this? If the service is good, someone will sign up. Why do you need to force people into this kind of stuff as well? So I do think a lot of it is less about finding these benign industries where everything's perfect. Very few, as we know, companies or industries are perfect that way. But each day, are we trying to have that intention to do something positive, treat people with dignity, with respect? That's a lot easier than we actually think. And I think Gen Z can be quite helpful to collaborate around that. And perhaps less critical, perhaps less of a cancel culture, and more of what do we practically do to help our customers feel more, better in their lives, our staff to feel more valued and able to flourish, our communities around us as well.
And how do you help leadership teams rediscover meaning when they've become disconnected from it?
I think what happens is we sort of end up playing the game. I don't know if you'd agree, Erika, from your experience, but there's a sort of metaphor business, especially in large corporates or even medium large corporates. There's a sense you're playing a game here. This is all a game and this is all sort of somewhat artificial. We're all here to, a bit like a game of Monopoly actually often. I think a lot of it is reconnecting people to say, look, this is not a game, right? You're actually making, whether you like it or not, you're impacting people, positively and negatively. Let's really be honest about what that looks like. What is the reality out there in the world you're operating in? So I've done work with groups like L'Oreal and so on. If you're even something, the world of beauty, for example, that has lots of questions to think about. But what is the impact you're having? How can we be a positive role model in that? How can you make this a positive experience for those who are buying your products, for example, all the way through? So yeah, I think there's a lot that can be, just with a bit of thought, a bit of reflection, stepping back, it can be powerful.
So I presume the disconnection, it often comes from a disconnection from either the product or service that they're selling or the stakeholders that sit around that organization.
So either it's around the service or product often, and not even about the product intrinsically. It's more about what's around the product. Are we doing everything we can to? So I think beauty actually is a good example. There's been so much more focus now on positive images, trying to make these things feel, the idea that we can all be normal. We're not trying to create some kind of some crazy superhuman image of what beauty looks like or wellness looks like and so on. So I think that's one example where there have been some positive trends. There's been negative stuff as well, but in general, there's some positive things. So it's more going back to saying, in the world we're in, people are going to be buying these products for a long time. That's a reality. Rather than sort of think about, should they be there? It's more, how can we try and make that better for them? How can we make it a more positive journey with those elements? So how do we bring stakeholders along on that journey and engage in a conversation with them at the same time?
And how would you suggest that organizations start to make those steps in that direction?
I think the first thing is we start with your employees, actually. They often have eyes and ears. Often as we get more senior in organizations, we get more and more detached from the front line, whatever that is, whether in the army or if we're selling, whatever, toilet paper or whatever it might be. So how do we reconnect with those younger employees? How do they see the world? How are they interacting with our customers, clients, stakeholders, communities? And let's start to understand their perspective. If we do the same on our end, and those in the C-suite or on the boards, let's come together and say what's common and what's different, and how do we try and understand that piece. The work I've been doing in Oxford is just about 4 things that are making big generational difference. One is around perspective. We're seeing the world differently. We're perhaps more incremental. Perhaps the next gen is a little bit more radical. Authenticity. I think we have a view of the world of work being a bit more of a game. I think there's more of a desire to be more authentic at work from Gen Z. Connection. I think we've focused a lot on often the efficiency of connection rather than the quality of it and the depth of that connection. And the last thing in terms of excellence, I think we tend to have a more absolute definition. There's a sort of floor or ceiling. I think Gen Z tends to have more of a mastery mindset. We want to go on a journey towards excellence. And neither view of the spectrums are right or wrong. We're at different sort of ends of the spectrum. How do we find a middle ground around those elements of pace? There's 4 sort of pieces there. So I think actually exploring them, making them open, discussing them, build them into company culture, think about how we run things in terms of processes, structures can be really game-changing in terms of future-proofing, both generations feeling at ease and able to prosper as the organization or company grows.
And how can organizations get those candid kind of insights, feedback? Obviously, the culture needs to be good enough, well established enough for people to feel comfortable speaking truth to power, because otherwise there's a different challenge there altogether. But how do they kind of start? I know that lots of companies do surveys, but arguably the number of people that fill them out or the purpose. I remember one survey that I was sent through when I was in an organization as a consultant. I shouldn't have received it. I wasn't an employee, but I did. And they had little smiley faces underneath, like 1 to 5. And the top kind of 2 had green smiley faces of kind of different levels of smile. And then as soon as you got to kind of 3, it was like a complete flat line. And then as soon as you got to the bottom 2, they were red. So instantly you draw people into a certain output. And even I looked at it as somebody that obviously had no skin in the game. And I thought, wow, okay, the smiley face is definitely the draw to this is the right answer. Click that button rather than just having numbers. How can organizations make sure they're not so biased, let's say, and also getting the real truth about it? Because a survey sometimes is a very flat piece of data.
I think I've worked at probably dozens, maybe hundreds of pulse surveys over these past years, and I think always find that there's a sort of passenger-driver dynamic, right? Somehow the driver is the leadership team or whatever. Everyone else is the passenger, and there's a sense of the passenger is giving feedback to the driver. I think a much better metaphor is that we're all driving this together. Some of us maybe towards the front of the the train or the car, someone's maybe in the middle, and so on. But we're all in this together. I think anything we do to avoid this sense that there's that kind of driver-passenger dynamic. So a lot of it is just having conversations, and it might be I am ending up actually being quite a lot of it kind of generational mediator in what I'm doing right now, talking to Gen Z first or younger employees in the workforce, understanding talking to perhaps say the partners of a law firm, and then trying to bring them together and say, this is what I'm hearing on this side, this is what I'm hearing on this. These are some of the points of similarity. Let's embrace them. How can we go even further with them? Often we forget there's actually a lot we do agree on. On these points of difference, they tend to relate to this kind of idea of pace. There's 4 areas. How do we resolve them? How do we address them? And how do we find a good middle ground? A middle doesn't mean exactly in the middle. It means based on those things. It requires reflective leaders, though, I think, who are open to listen. It also requires younger employees to also be open to understand that there are realities of running a business. It's got to be financially sound, got to make sure that they're healthy first and foremost. So I think, but a lot of it is if we can have a safe, neutral space where we can talk together and really develop ideas together. We live in a very polarized world, as we know more generally, Erika, and that's really shut down a lot of the discussion, the sense of us creating constructively together across generations and more widely.
And people need to feel that they can voice their perspective without having potential backlash from that, whether it's whatever, obviously within the realms of, what's decent and right and fair for everybody, but having to kind of toe the line sometimes on a particular strong character's perspective and feeling very much having to keep their own perspective boxed and quiet can be quite a challenge. How do you balance the different generations, because the different generations don't necessarily perfectly fit in an organization that all of the younger people sit at the bottom of the food chain and all the older people sit at the top, because you can end up with all sorts of different dynamics, and that can really change a leadership team if you have somebody quite young. I was 32 when I was a C-suite governance professional, and that was quite young compared to everybody else that was around me. And that created some tension of itself, not purposefully, but just a different generation, different conversations. And it's a shift, isn't it? How do people make that shift?
Yeah, so I think that I think Patrick Dunn's done some really good work on this, but there's now 5 generations in the workforce. And so that's the most we've ever had really in any meaningful way, tangible way. So that's a key piece. So it's less about binary, it's less about one generation versus another. I think it's another way of thinking about inclusion and creating cultures that really allow everyone to find that sweet spot for themselves, I think is part of that sort of battle there. I would say, though, I think C-suite leaders themselves feel quite attacked right now. So I feel many who've been on panels in front of their employees, and they will say something probably a little bit off color or slightly out of context, and they will get hammered by the younger employees. So I think it's a two-way thing. I think it's definitely true that many young people don't feel particularly emotionally or psychologically safe to express things, for sure. But I think many C-suites are quite leading too, because they feel if I'm honest about stuff, so if I'm honest what it takes to be successful, to really get to the top of their organization, they will be criticized or maybe even attacked by those earlier on. So I sort of feel like both sides are sort of switching off and defending themselves rather than really coming together and connecting and saying, let's find a common point of view here.
And you reconnect them by bringing them together and allowing them space.
Yeah, I think in person is powerful. I think a lot of it's first talking, though, in small groups, getting a sense of what each group is feeling, getting a sense of what the issues really are. It's classic sort of mediation in many regards when it comes to this kind of work. And sometimes it's about trying to find a middle ground between. Sometimes it's about finding another alternative that will actually break the deadlock altogether. So I remember talking to one professional services firm where there was a big thing about work-life balance, right? And Gen Z employees were often saying, look, I really want work-life balance. That's an important value. And the managers of the organization were saying, yeah, but I'm a human too. And if you go down this route, I'm going to be the one who's deeply unbalanced. And it was super simple stuff, but actually them seeing that and hearing there was a personal consequence to all of this stuff really helped unlock it for them. And we developed some new ways of thinking about how do we all just achieve better work, really high quality work together, much more meaningful, much more client friendly. Let's take out some of the bells and whistles that were taking up a lot of time that the client didn't really value, but would actually almost make them feel that you were providing a better service to them.
Yes, in organizations, you can have different generations in different sectors, whether that's or different levels of management, whether they are employees or very senior. How do you blend a variety of different generations within, let's say, the kind of lowest tier of employees, or even from my own experience, I was 32 when I stepped into the boardroom. That created some tension of itself because I was all of a sudden in the C-suite level of people. How do organizations manage that?
Yeah, so we've got 5 generations at work now, Erika, as we know, and probably the most, in terms of just real magnitude of a piece. And I think the way that our pension systems are working, and so on, that probably might continue for quite a while. Maybe we'll get to 6, who knows? But I think that's a really exciting opportunity because it's no longer sort of binary. We're not looking up or looking down. We're looking both ways. And so the group I teach at Oxford, for example, on the Generations Against Lab course, what we're talking a lot about, how do you have influence upwards and downwards? So at the beginning of your career, it's probably going to be more upwards. You're going to be thinking about how do you impact those above you and influence them and try to help shape the world in different ways. But almost certainly from the beginning, you're going to have teams right after you finish the MBA who you're also leading and trying to be a role model towards as well. And it's a bit like, my wife has recently become a therapist, and she still has to do therapy herself. And it's really important to sort of see both sides of it, actually. It makes us, I think, more reflective. It makes us, I think, more self-critical in a good way in that regard as well. So I don't think it's about one way up, but it's really thinking about how do I take that generational perspective to everything I do, whichever way that issue might be facing. An issue might be more relevant for Gen Z. It might be more relevant towards the C-suite. I find many C-suite leaders now feeling quite vulnerable. They're not able to be fully honest themselves when they speak at public forums or even internal employee forums. They feel a bit guarded. I think we've got to think about how we can attack those issues from different points in the generational spectrum.
Yeah. And the organizations, as you say, where those CEOs are feeling quite guarded, I think you're right. There's so many more people being so much more vocal about how they feel. And we see that in politics, and we see that in organizations, and we see that in people standing up and being those advocates for particular perspectives in the world. How do you manage that? Because obviously as a CEO, you also need to be able to lead. And if you feel like you can't speak your truth to everybody else, that's obviously can be a limiting factor. It can hold you back. But also you have to understand who sits within your organization, who those stakeholders are wider than just those employees. It's a big balance, right?
It's a tricky one. I think ultimately you have to stand for something as a leader. I think, our Prime Minister in the UK has had this, right, where we won an election, in a way almost being the opposite of something else that was there, rather than being particularly clear what really we were standing for. And I think that's now coming back to bite very heavily. And it's a real, I'm really hopeful they'll find a way out, but it's tricky period to be in right now. So I do think it's important to, in that back to that definition of I'm helping people reach places they wouldn't reach otherwise. We've got to define what that new place is, why it's better. And we've got to stand our ground and say, this is important. I know there'll be some tough compromises, maybe some sacrifices along the way to get there. But let's really talk about that new place. Why is it exciting? Why will everyone benefit? Why will it be a better place for us all? That's the bit I think leaders now find quite tricky to do. I think leadership has become management. It's become mechanized. It's become a series of quarterly templates and results and earnings and all these things we're comfortable. We see so much board attention go to, rather than that deeper question of what are we actually trying to achieve? Where are we trying to go? And how do we all get there together? The core of it.
Yeah. And looking more at founders, they can find it quite difficult to step back from operations as the team and the business grows and becomes a bigger organization. What have you learned about leading through that sort of a situation?
Yeah, I was actually in a very fascinating discussion with a group of folks who work with founders last week, actually. And there was a psychotherapist who came and talked, and she was looking at how many founders actually have had some kind of generational trauma themselves. They've had, often it's fathers, for example, who perhaps left or passed away early, and they want to prove something to the world as well, if it's guys, and perhaps the other way for female founders. But I think there's something very powerful about founders, that we need them to change the world. We won't be able to get to where we need to get to without that energy, that creative career destruction that's part of their work as well. At the same time, I think there's something about helping founders see something beyond them and not completely enmesh what they do versus what the organization needs. And I stepped out of my second organization that I founded because I felt like there was founder syndrome. I was being the constraint to growth after a point of 10 years. We got to very big scale. It wasn't my skill set. I really enjoyed the more nimble entrepreneurial days as well. But I think often we need to give space for founders to think about where they are. Are they really at the right place for their organization at this point? But also, what do they want to do next? Often a lot of it's they get stuck because they don't know what the next step is. They can still have impact influence in a different way. It could be as an advisor, an investor, for example. Lots of other permutations there as well. They could set up something new in a new area, but helping them feel positive and bring that energy somewhere else, I found is really important for founders, so they can unlock something new and then they really leave a strong legacy and succession with their existing organization at the same time.
And that sort of principled approach can also really help, I guess, as an organization grows, because as they take those hats off and start passing them to other people that sit within their organization, they need to start relinquishing some of that responsibility and giving that trust to others. Otherwise, you end up stifling all sorts of growth and opportunities, and also the people that are in your organization.
Yeah, and I think back to that kind of hour hand, minute hand, second hand metaphor. If as leaders we want to play at the hour hand level as a C-suite or the CEO level, we need to make sure there's strong people at the second and the minute hand as well. So how do we give them that autonomy? We don't second guess day-to-day decisions. We don't try and get too operationally. We make sure that the overall metrics and performance is going well, but we really focus on how we're building the new place, that new destination. That's where I find the most healthy teams work, and everyone knows where they fit in. They see it all come together. They can be honest with each other at different points, and then it's easier for a founder to know this is a time to, almost I've got it to the place I wanted to get to. Now someone else needs to come with new energy, take it to that next place from there.
There's definitely been a lot of discussion, particularly on social media, about founders kind of leaving and then the organization crumbles because they were part of the glue that held it all together, and let's say a hired CEO can never quite have the same level of passion as the person that created it in the first place. Do you think that's true?
Definitely seen lots of it, and I've stepped in to help quite a few of those situations. I think back to the sort of a wine analogy, you almost want to have culture in an organization, like a bottle of wine. We look at the label, look at what's in there, what grapes are in there. It needs to be defined and codified. It can mature, it can evolve, as any good wine does, but there's something already quite strong as a foundation for that bottle to begin with. And I think where that happens, where things collapse or is where there hasn't been enough attention to really making things a bit tacit, more explicit, more understood, more codified, especially as organizations grow. So as new people come in, culture can get quite watered down, it can get diluted. How do you really keep this sort of integrity of that bottle all the way through?
And moving more to kind of inflection points. So you often describe leadership as being tested at moments of inflection. Can you share a time when you saw that tested kind of up close, either your own journey or with a leader that you've supported?
So I was the CEO of an education organization at that time. We were working in about 300 schools at that point in India. And the government of Delhi came to us and said, we really want to work with you, want to collaborate, partner with you, but we want you to get to 20,000 schools almost overnight. And I tried for 4 or 5 times to actually just shut it down and sort of not get into it. Felt too crazy, too almost too mystical to try and achieve. But they were just being so persistent. And at one point they just said, look, either go big or go home. We'll stop, the partnership altogether if you don't scale in the way we need. We need you to really be working with every child in our system. And to be fair, going back to boards, our board was really great about that. They said, look, this is the story, this is the reality we're in. We're not sure how to get there exactly, but we trust that you'll be able to find your way through. Our job as a board is let's meet every quarter as we do now, but let's focus on less about current metrics because they were close to irrelevant now. As you go on this new journey, let's look at the direction you're going in. What do we need to know as you go along that you're on track towards that new direction? So are staff able to lead in a much more leveraged way? Could they work with people already in the system and get them to more of the day-to-day work of our approach? Could they, were we really getting senior level buy-in from the very top of government so we could get the right cultural changes into the system, for example? So it was a kind of, yes, we're very much there to support you, but we want to see that you're really on track and you're not deluding yourselves. This can be done. Let's use the next 18 months to test whether we can go on this new journey of inflection. But if there are any sort of roadblocks, let's come back and think about things again and maybe slow things down if we need to along the way. So it was a great example of board not saying yes or no or trying to outguess me as the CEO, but saying, yeah, we understand where you're coming from. Let us be the kind of guardrails around that. Let us ask good questions and make sure that you're really going on the journey in the best way possible.
And it really helps the CEO when you have that support of the board, knowing that they are trying to set you up for success. Okay, they understand that there could be some challenges along the way and it may not be successful, but they're there with you. That must have really helped how you dealt with the situation.
And I was a very entrepreneurial CEO, Eric. So I wasn't a sort of I wasn't a mature CEO who wanted to keep things very stable. Well, I think what the best boards I've seen at least work with, they tend to help the CEO be the best version of themselves they can be. They're not trying to change the person. They realize they've got a certain style, certain approach, but they are trying to make sure they are that they really flourish in that perspective. But they don't also hit any kind of Johari window areas where you can't see ourselves, where we have these blind spots. So just making sure that nothing goes wrong along that piece. They're very supportive, especially in that growth stage when it's sort of more founder driven and so on. But they are also critical friends and honest and open, but always in a way of supporting the CEO and the leadership team to get to where they want to go. I think where things break down is when the board starts playing, almost wants to own the strategy, drive it. And there's a myth in corporate, in most organizations, that boards set strategy. I think that's really, it's rare, I think, as well. Maybe technically, perhaps in a fiduciary sense, but there's such an asymmetry of involvement, typically for most boards, that isn't realistic in most cases, in my knowledge anyway.
And I suppose it works the other way around as well. I've got from my own experience of running a business and having two people that sit as independent directors on my board, that as the CEO, you can be in situations where you ask questions of them or you're presenting a particular idea to them and they do come back, and whilst they are supportive, they also respect that you have a different perspective and a different approach. And although they may have felt that the direction of travel on reading the agenda and the papers was a certain way, they're actually happy to be, I suppose, steered to a certain extent, not pushed out of what they believe. That's not quite what I'm saying, but more their eyes are opened to a different way because that CEO, they trust in that CEO as much as they are given trust to that CEO.
Yeah, the best board meetings I've attended, I've helped CEOs set up quite a few of these, is where all the sort of more formal stuff, the report, the performance overview, all of that side is done in 45 minutes. And then there's 2 hours of open discussion of whatever at that point is the most pressing issue. It's also anchored on the strategy and milestones and so on, but it's open to discuss whatever it is. And it genuinely is a discussion. And the CEO will say, look, I'm really torn between, these are 3 parts I could take. Here's the situation. I've got these options. I'm not sure about the financial implications of A, or I'm worried about the people implications of B. And it's a genuine discussion where people are creating together and doing that as well. So it's not performative. You're not going in to play a game. It's really one where you're trying to use all of that external perspective the board has, their diverse strengths and skills, and it's additive to the company itself. But I don't think that many, I don't know, you know better than I do, but not that many board meetings work in quite that way.
No, they definitely don't. And that is something that's always strikes me as interesting. Before I stepped out to be a CEO, I was advising boards. Therefore, it was very easy for me to have an objective, independent perspective and say, you should be using the time with the board to help air some of your ideas. They're there to help move things forward. And if you feel that you can only present them with the finished article, it's never going to help. And the board is then pretty much just a box tick. It's like, okay, this is what we're being presented. This is the answer. Do we agree? Don't we agree? If we don't agree, maybe we fall out with the CEO or create some unnecessary tension. Is it worth it? Where do we put the pressure? Do we say yes or no? Which of the agenda items do we agree on, or which ones do we, want to push a little bit? And then it becomes a game, but it becomes a game from the other side as well of like trying to keep tensions low, essentially. But you need that curiosity and you need those discussions that are a bit more interesting, a bit more exciting. You need to have that disagreement. You just need to be respectful disagreement.
Yeah. And I think the generational element plays out in boards. So I see a lot of boards which are basically captured by usually a couple of people who've been there for a long time. They may formally be the chair or not, but implicitly everyone sort of kowtows to them, and it's there's not much dissent and much genuine discussion, debate, and it becomes that's I think the irony of the board story is that we've been bringing many more diverse people to boards, but in terms of cognitive diversity, it sort of still hasn't really opened up different ways of thinking, different ways of exploring issues. And I think that needs a shake-up. Often the younger generations of board members who often now come on boards, there's a very strong implicit message that your job is just to stay largely quiet. You can make a comment here, but you're not really going to rock the boat too much. And that's why I think when we get into our biggest problems is when that isn't happening at the board level also. And
what gives you hope about the next generation of leaders?
I just think there's just less crap. I think it's just more that they're much wanting to cut to the chase. I think there haven't been all of these things are not good things. They weren't able to get perhaps on the housing ladder in the same way we were. They weren't able to perhaps aren't able to have the same security early on in their careers. They didn't have the same intimacy. I mean, in terms of professional, in terms of really having mentors and nurturing, perhaps the way we did in our early careers, especially in more structured job environments. But as a result, I think they're much less tolerant of the nonsense we put up with, I think, as a world, and much more willing to get to the chase and say, why are we doing this? And I think there's a real desire to know why do we need to do it this way? And some of that is naive, some of it can be frustrating, and I've felt it at times, but a lot of it actually, if you really ask that question, why are we doing it? There isn't often a good reason. It can be done so much better. And so if you can use that restlessness, that openness, that wanting to reshape things more radically in a positive way, but add the wisdom and the experience that comes with age and with sort of time in a role, I think we can have a really beautiful sort of cocktail of the two things happening. And that's why I think, proudly optimistic, we need to crack that generational collaboration, understanding, but it can unlock so much in shaping a better world.
And you've spoken a little bit before, you've used the analogy from Mike Tyson, or the quote from Mike Tyson, a fight plan is great until you get punched in the face. That's really quite pivotal, I think. I know you've spoken about it in a teaching kind of education perspective, but have you got any examples with regards to organisations you've worked with, or anything that might be helpful for our listeners with regards to boards?
Yeah, so I think I should say Mike Tyson is not the perfect role model, but I think it was a very good quote on that one. But on that point, I think I've been helping a group in America called Partners Public Good. They've just spun out of Harvard, and they're trying to reimagine procurement. Actually, so a lot of it's around governance and so on, and make procurement across, I think it's about several $1 trillion of spend every year across the states, just more thoughtful, more intentional, so we can all have better public services as citizens. And what's been really impressive with the spin out is they've done it. They've felt this is the time to do it. They've kept very good relations with Harvard, which they owe a lot of gratitude for everything they've done to get through this point. But they've also been feeling their way very emergently, really, as well. They're building, for example, a network of professionals that I've been helping them think about. But they haven't gone and saying, this is the only answer. We'll try things, we'll try events, we'll try platforms, see what sticks, we'll talk to our members. And we're kind of gradually edging to the right answer. It's not going to happen overnight. It's going to be a much more emergent view of getting to that goal of helping influence better services for all in that regard.
And if you could leave one message for our listeners about leadership that lasts, what would that be?
Yeah, I think really try and think about how you can future-proof success, first of all, but with a long haul perspective, and ideally across generations. So let's really get to that hour hand, really feel like an hour hand, take that much longer term perspective. And I think everything we do then will feel much more meaningful, much more purposeful, and we'll leave a much bigger and better legacy.
It was really great to speak to Sharath today. He really opened the box on the generational challenges within organisations and how organisations can start to unpack that. I think that it starts with finding purpose, and that purpose is something then that generations can get behind, and assuming that they are able to do that, That then means that the organisation can move forward where everybody, as he mentioned, wherever they are sat on the bus, whether they're at the front or the back, they can move forward and they can feel really part of what they're trying to create. I think finally, it's also about impact. So what do you do and what does that look like in reality? And you can talk quite a lot about generational challenges, but the reality is, what are you going to do about it and how are you going to engage those people? And one of the insights that I got from him was that it's all about conversations. It's about talking to those individuals, really understanding and learning what it is that matters to them. And whilst that might not necessarily meet perfectly in the middle, it does mean that you will understand those stakeholders, those individuals, and hopefully you can move forward together with a shared purpose. That's it for this episode of Grit in the Boardroom. Thanks to Sharath for sharing his story with honesty and insight, and thank you for listening. If you found this conversation valuable, please follow the show and share it with someone who leads through complexity. Until next time, stay thoughtful, stay brave, and stay in the room.